Hello and welcome. This is Mr. Gunn's advice on religious experience essays. In this session I'll be using some advice from Laura Mears How to Get an A grade in Philosophy, as well as other resources such as AS and A-Level Religious Studies, Philosophy and Ethics through diagrams, and the answers that were submitted by my students. The first useful activity might be to have a look at an examination question. If we look at the example provided here, examine the strengths and weaknesses of the argument for the existence of God based on religious experience. And the argument merely indicates the probability of God, and this is of little value to a religious believer. Discuss. I think this is a good question to receive in the exam in terms of being fairly straightforward and relating to your learning very directly. Now, I think there are some areas to highlight here, and the first would be that in part one, one of the trickier aspects is to make sure your answer is tailored to explain actually whether or not the strengths and weaknesses argue for the existence of God, rather than just the validity of the religious experience. So there's an extension to the argument. It's not just is the religious experience genuine, it's furthermore, how does it work as evidence for God's existence? Is it a useful addition to that argument? And in the second question, the key is that we're looking at the debate over probability. Does the fact that so many people claim religious experience increase the probability of God steadily, or is that a logic that you would question and disagree with? Now, here's the first tip that I'm providing using the resources from Laura Mears, which is that you should show in the introduction that the answer will follow the pattern of the question set in a structured way. We also do something similar now in part two, which we say positions our argument. And it is still using the question wording, but because it's slightly more advanced, you're looking for the pattern. So here the pattern is that the strengths and weaknesses will inform whether there is a reasonable argument for the existence of God. So that the questions are clearly more advanced in A2. And deal with evidence. So in an introduction on religious experience, you might therefore introduce the idea of varieties of religious experience and therefore a variety of evidence. For an A1 question, your answer should be dense with terminology, scholarship, quotation and sound reasoning, with examples appropriately deployed. What we mean by that is not long-ranging examples, not examples that take too long to explain rather, but concise, sensibly choiced examples. When you're thinking of organising your revision, you might think about the following key scholars. We have Caroline Franks Davis, Brian Davies, Anthony Flew, John Hick, Richard Swinburne, Peter Vardy as well. But as we know for this topic, you can't just think about key scholars, you should also think about key types of religious experience. There are many different ways of classifying religious experience: direct, indirect, and the 7 different varieties outlined in your textbook, and public or private experiences. And your goal is to be able to use the terminology effectively throughout your essay. And depending on the question, you may choose to take some time explaining the different types, particularly if you're asked to, for example, consider whether some amounts as a better resource of evidence than others. And the third thing to consider for part one is that there are several key ideas. Now, I'd certainly argue that Swinburne produces many of these key ideas. Laura Mears supports that as she talks about key concepts such as analogy, credulity, and testimony. We know that the principle of credulity and testimony are principles of rationality based on the prior probability, or using the prior probability of God's existence. and they come from Swinburne. And so I suppose if we were to choose a key scholar, one main scholar, it would be Swinburne. In your answer, you get credit for a breadth of scholarly input or depth. However, if you opt for depth, let's say if you use the arguments presented by Swinburne as your primary driver for the essay, then you still need contributions from other people, but they should be contributing to the debate that he is proposing, which can be done for the arguments based using inductive reasoning. But in general, I think our teaching has given you the better facilities to be able to talk about a breadth of experience. So I would aim for some breadth where you can. And I do recommend looking into purchasing some of your own revision resources to aid you during study leave and at times like that. Here we have provided from Laura Mears a breakdown of past questions on religious experience, and we can see that the variety extends from whether religious experience provides evidence and reasons to support belief in God, or to examine the essential ideas and key principles, to debate whether or not the religious experience counts as good evidence for the existence of God and the strengths and weaknesses. So you can pause on this screen now if you want to look back at some of the past questions. For the 2011 and 2012 question asking you to examine the essential ideas or key principles for the argument for God based on religious experience, the examiner's report says that a good response typically opened with a reference to the argument from religious experience rather than to features of the religious experience. Which means that for this particular question, the essential ideas, key principles question, just starting with a list of different types of religious experiences and outlining the details there is not necessarily the best way to go about answering this question. Advice from the examiner's report in 2012 says, ensure you do not spend too long on types, descriptions or technical terms for religious experience. Instead, proceed to the argument. How does this experience function in the argument? How is it used as evidence to argue for God's existence? And therefore, looking at the scientific psychological responses from the psychologist James, or using Swinburne's credulity and testimony, and looking at the posteriori evidence is a much better way of responding. In part 2, you're often asked to consider whether the existence of God is made more probable, whether the argument itself is trustworthy, or whether the evidence is in fact not conclusive. All of these asking you to value the argument now. So your criticisms are best to save for part 2, even if there is some wording in the question where you could use criticisms. The point is you do need to save some for part 2, as that's where they will receive most credit. To answer this sort of question, you actually have been given some resources which list different types of challenges, and they're ones that I think are really effective and actually quite simple to use, and they include the vicious circle challenge and the conflicting claims challenge and the scholar that you can attribute to these arguments is Peter Vardy. Both of these belong to him, and you can outline his views. Another good scholar to use in your part 2 would be Richard Dawkins, as he offers a fairly straightforward scientific response to suggest that the evidence is, for example, not conclusive, trustworthy, or doesn't make the existence of God more probable, as he would dispute most of the grounds for the evidence, particularly when it comes from personal experience. In this section, I'm going to give you some information that you could pause on, but you actually have a lot of this anyway, but I'm going to give you some information on the key scholars just to remind you of what I think are the key principles of their argument. We remember William James's 4 marks of the mystical experience as PINT, pint, but here we have an explanation of the ineffable qualities, noetic, transient, and passive qualities of religious experience, which he argued were absolutely authoritative in terms of an individual's life post a religious experience, and that counted as strong evidence for the effects on their life, as if to suggest something very real has happened to them. However, there is evidence against some of these, and when you look at the weaknesses, the best method for, in part 2, examining the weaknesses of James's varieties experience is to actually pick a feature such as passivity, and then to debate whether or not, in fact, some of the major, most notable religious experiences are completely passive, whether there is a sense of powerlessness, or sometimes individuals instead feel like they have some control, they're much more lucid in their experience. The same for ineffability. What about all those people that claim that they can reveal more about their experience in real terms, in realist language, in language that's understandable? Does that therefore reduce the quality of their religious experience? Is James a little bit unclear about these? When thinking about part 2 as well, I don't want you to overlook these 2 scholars. So for part 2, I'm sure the choice of the hipster will be to refer to Freud and Marx, sociological and psychological perspectives. Now, for Freud, the idea was that the projection of a father figure of God through the form of religion is nothing more than a form of wishful thinking because of neurosis and an unconscious neurotic illness related to, you guessed it, repressed sexual memories. Karl Marx called religion the opium of the people, in that what it does is helps to control people, makes them less likely to revolt. Nietzsche called religion a slave morality for this reason, something that if you think about the core beliefs of religion, they promise a better world, a better life for subservience during this life, and he thought that was a mistake, and that the religious experiences simply show either they're a means to keep people religious and to suppress them, or they're the product of the dominant control from the ideology of the bourgeois. What I mean by that is that the religious experiences themselves would therefore not be credited by Marx as coming from anything supernatural. Now I'm going to start talking through some examples that I found in your work. And here we have an introduction. It says, use this intro. So I thought, okay, I will. A religious experience is considered to be an encounter with the divine. There are a wide variety of religious experiences with strengths and weaknesses. So here we've got the question wording straight away. Of course, that's good. And it's not in just a simplistic way. Here in the sentence, to refer to the strengths and weaknesses has a real purpose, which is to say that these experiences are categorized into 7 types by Caroline Franks Davies, a key scholar, such as numinous or quasi-sensory experience. People who have experienced a religious experience have tried to argue for the existence of God throughout history and perhaps across different religions. This is a good introduction. It ticks most of the boxes. It's a good length because we would expect it to be about half the size of the first paragraph. And so you can't get your A star from just your introduction, but this is a really good attempt. The only thing that we may think about to improve the answer is to suggest that as there is a variety of religious experiences, that just make it clear that their strengths and weaknesses may therefore vary. I would imagine in this answer that's what will come very shortly. Here we have a near perfect example of a paragraph 1. The breadth of scholarly input is impressive in a quick space of time, and the technical terminology and the level of comprehension as well. We have in the evidential force of religious experience. Caroline Franks Davies outlines 7 types of religious experience. So this would follow on nicely from the introduction. An example is a regenerative or conversion experience, such as that of Saul to St. Paul. We know that's a key experience. And then we move to Rudolf Otto. Rudolf Otto described the numinous experience. So we're discussing different types. But here we get such events where they are both now being discussed at once, and they result in a change of faith. And by suggesting that they result in a change of faith, we're introducing the idea of evidence for the argument for the existence of God. It's a strength, as they're so dramatic and life-changing. Another type of religious experience listed by Davies is a mystical experience, whereby the recipient experiences the ultimate reality and sense of unity with the divine. Furthermore, these experiences are often ineffable. And you can tell, can't you, that this is now going to transition into discussing William James, and I can tell you that the rest of the paragraph here talks about William James's 4 marks of a mystical experience, and the strength that is highlighted is the consistency with those marks across mystical experiences. But the scholar of this answer, I'm looking at the rest of their answer, has said that perhaps the inability, the ineffability to translate the religious experience to explain what it was like to other people is its inherent weakness, and I think that is a sensible point to make. Here we have a section of writing on Swinburne, who I've identified as a key scholar, and I can tell you that before I cut the section of this answer out, what we have outlined is the inductive argument with the premises and the conclusions, where Swinburne decides that as it is possible to experience God, and we have an amount of evidence for this, God must exist. A strength of this argument is that it is a logical. Now, that is an inherent strength. It follows a pattern of logic as it's using inductive reasoning, providing greater credibility. Furthermore, if the premises are correct, then so is the conclusion. The only subtle change we can make here is to say that it actually makes the conclusion highly probable. The inductive argument cannot produce certain conclusions. Instead, there's only a little difference. This answer would still get credit, but to make it exactly precise, we'd say the conclusion is highly probable. However, a weakness of using inductive reasoning is that an experience of X does not always indicate the reality of X, as our reality can easily be mistaken. That is really well written. It's a perfect explanation of a weakness, and what we could think about there is whether or not this plants the seeds to evaluate by using someone like Dawkins later, who talks about the ways in which our brain can play trick on us or make us misinterpret information, particularly sensory information. Here we have a part 1 explanation of Benny Hinn, and we have an explanation of the corporate experience, and it's another good example of talking about the strengths and weaknesses, as we say that due to the music and atmosphere, the audience members may feel faint and the presence of God. Now, in fact, you might say that the corporate experience is contributed to by the music and atmosphere. That just sounds ever so slightly sceptical, which for part 1 is taking a bit of a risk. But I do like the phrasing of the next section, which is that people argue that this is a strength to the argument, as many people with different backgrounds can encounter the experience. So it's not just one individual. That's a very good point. And then to link it with the Toronto blessing, where many individuals gather and have different reactions and talk about the strength of receiving so much evidence in one go is a good idea. It's good to do that in part 1. The inherent weakness of an experience like that is that it's sometimes considered and labelled as mass hysteria. As we start to look at part 2, this is part 2 now, where we have some actual evaluation of the arguments. We've got a good example here. Swinburne would argue that the claims only conflict because those who had experienced the divine would only be able to interpret them with their prior beliefs. This is a counter-argument to an argument that was just put forward in the section. where we're debating whether or not people only seeing the deities or gods that they're raised expected to experience or that they have knowledge of, whether that's a strength or a weakness. And there are different perspectives on that being outlined here. For example, for someone who is brought up as a Christian, they would see a Christian God in the same way Hindus would see their idea of the divine, something like Ganesh. For many religious believers, this explanation would be sufficient. Yet surely the counter-argument makes them less valid, as it's sensible to question, as Peter Cole did in Religious Experience, if God can really be identified, how would you recognise that attribute? If what you can see is just a projection of what you already believe and expect to see, then are you really seeing God? Swinburne's counter-argument neither proves nor disproves God. He just provides a weak explanation which surprisingly convinces many. Moving into clear judgment there, but what we have is a scholar that is building towards a conclusion. There's more that justifies her opinions here. Another additional part of a section 2 where we look at St. Paul, and this is an evaluation point that I recommend lots of you do attempt to make. If we look at St. Paul's conversion, we can see the convincing elements, particularly the influence it has on people to have a significant conversion. And here we have someone who's researched into the idea that it may have been a form of epilepsy, or that even he was struck by lightning. Rather than being just focused on these specific solutions to the problem, instead make sure that the debate, this is fine how it's done here, but do make sure that the debate, particularly in part 2, then centres around the suggestion that perhaps modern interpretations would invalidate the experiences. This is taken from a part 1, but I'm suggesting that you can extend and add your opinion to these sorts of points in part 2. Here's an example of a conclusion, and I just thought I'd show you it because it's a small conclusion. Sometimes you're running out of time, but it's successful, and it meets the standards of the marking criteria very closely, because you can see how this person will have built towards this conclusion in their argument. Well, that's not guaranteed, of course, but you'll have to take my word for it. In conclusion, religious experiences do not successfully indicate the probability of God, perfect referring to the question wording, they do not successfully indicate the probability, especially to those without prior religious beliefs. So this person must have, in order for this to be successful, discussed the importance of prior religious beliefs. So I'd expect the answer to include conflicting claims and vicious circle challenges. However, religious experiences are likely to enhance the beliefs of those who already believe in God. This is simplistic, but I think it's absolutely fine. Okay, bit pressed for times, that will have to do. I hope it's been helpful in some way, and best of luck with your mock examinations.